Hey, it's Kley. Welcome to another video. Today is going to be the final installment of my Princeton Reverb build. I'm very excited to share with you guys all my hard work and show you the final product. I think the amp came out really good, and it's definitely been, I say this every time, but really honestly one of my favorite builds, and I'm really proud of the amp that I came out with here in the end. I think the most exciting thing is when you get through all the hard work and you do all the steps and you finally get to that point where you power the amp on and it just works. Is really thrilling. It's almost kind of like meeting your newborn child for the first time. It just is a thrill unlike any other. And definitely leave a comment down below if you think it's reasonable to compare building an amplifier to having a child. So definitely let me know your thoughts down below. But all that said, also please check out down in the description some of the links that I've got if you want to support my channel to encourage me to make more videos like this. I've got an email in the description as well if you want to send me an email with your own questions or project ideas. I love chatting with you guys, and also I'd love to hear from you down below what you think about this amp. The agenda for today is we're going to pick it up where we left off. We're going to run through some initial startup procedures. I'm going to go through some of that, and if you want greater detail on any of this, definitely let me leave a comment down below. During my startup testing procedures, I did discover a few little errors that needed to be ironed out, and so I fixed those. And then I'm just going to go right into a tone demonstration, walking through all the features of the amp and showing off how it sounds. This is a really great amp. I would say it's not the most versatile amp in the world, but it definitely does its trick really well. And that is just a fantastic, clean to edge of breakup, blues, rock, country guitar amplifier. Just a really fantastic tone. Then lastly, I do also want to walk through some of the modifications that I made. I really wanted to keep the heart and spirit of the Princeton Reverb available, and I didn't want to stray too far away, but you guys know me, I just can't help myself and love to tinker just a little bit with the circuit. And what I focused on was the mid-range content. Black face Fender amps are known for having that scooped mid-range tone. That's their key identity. But with a couple of tweaks specifically to the negative feedback and to the mid-range control, adding a mid-range control, boosting that up all the way and taking out the negative feedback, you can really boost that mid-range up to get a little more of a tweed tone actually, while at the same time when you go back to those stock settings, you're not in any way, shape, or form taking away from the stock sound of the amp. So just a very simple but also powerful modification that I want to walk through. So all that said, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Let's go ahead and dive in. Okay, let's start about startup procedures. I have a link in the description to Rob Robinette's webpage. It's the Bible for guitar amplifiers as far as I'm concerned. Check it out. He has a really awesome write-up and walkthrough. But I also want to give you guys my spin on how I go through things and kind of what I'm thinking about as I'm going through initial startup. Startup is an interesting time in the amp build because it's really critical. You know, you've spent all this time planning, buying things, building it, and then finally you're getting so close to the point where you can actually turn it on, get some electricity running through that amp. Very exciting, but you really need to make sure that you give yourself a little bit of a break and a pause, and come back with fresh eyes and ears in mind, and go through the startup procedures as they need to be done. You don't want to skimp out on this part of the project because it's really important. Now, the main thing I'm trying to suss out is to see if I've made any mistakes during my build. I want to really flesh out, see if there's any errors or problems that need to be fixed. So this is really a great time to be doing that. So one of the first things that I do is I usually print off a schematic or a layout, kind of whatever I'd use to build the amp, and I just kind of do one final walk through the amp where I actually take a highlighter and will highlight through each of the individual connections in the amplifier, and then go into the schematic or into the amplifier that I have built and make sure that they are there correctly as laid out on the control. And you'll be really kind of amazed and impressed how many times you've kind of missed something or one little detail here or there. And I definitely discovered a couple errors doing that myself. Once you've checked that, and then I move to startup. And the first thing I do with startup is I get my light bulb current limiter out. Now, I've got my current limiter right back here. It's just a very simple box. I've got a light bulb that's plugged into a bulb socket. That bulb socket is plugged into a power cord that can go into the wall. So the power from the wall comes in and it feeds into the bulb, and then from there it goes out into the power cord that's going to feed my amplifier. So I've basically placed a light bulb in line, in series, with the power that is going to feed the amplifier. And I can go into more detail on this if you want to show an explanation video on how to build your own light bulb current limiter for basically just a couple dollars at a hardware store. It's very inexpensive to do, and I'd say it's a must for any amp builder or tinkerer. And the main reason why it's so nice is because if you have a problem in your amp that is going to cause it to draw too much current, that's a problem that could potentially destroy things. Capacitors, tubes, transformers. It could be a devastating problem if they're just drawing infinite amount of current because something isn't wired quite right. So what the light bulb current limiter does is it absorbs all that extra energy and power that would go to powering up the amp, and it converts it into light and heat in the light bulb. And so it keeps the amp safe. And number two, it also gives you a very clear warning flash saying, hey, something is wrong. So I plug the amp in and I turn the power on. And when you ever use the light bulb current limiter, you want to expect that there's going to be initial flash of light, and then that is going to die down to more of a normal or standard or much lower level. And so when I powered this amp on, that part of it was okay. Then I go into the amp and I start taking some AC voltages, and the power coming in, that 120 volts on the primary side of the power transformer, so that's on the power switch, the fuse, and then going into the power transformer. You just want to check for 120 volts all throughout that circuit. Then once that part is good, you go to the secondary side. So you've got the high B plus voltage, you've got the 50 volt AC supplied to the bias, and you've got the 3.4 volt heater supply. So you want to check to see all those secondary voltages are kind of in line as well. Now, when you have the light bulb current limiter in line, the voltages aren't going to be 100% correct because some of that voltage is going to get absorbed into the light bulb, but you want it to be within range. So, for example, your high voltage, if you want it to be like 200, higher than 250 volts, or your heaters, right? You want it to be 2 to 3 volts, somewhere in the general ballpark to make sure that things are okay. So when I was running through this part of the procedure, I discovered that the 50 volt bias supply, something was off there. The voltages were a little odd, but I couldn't quite kind of put my finger on what was going on. And as I was taking voltage, maybe the amp was on for 1 or 2 or 3 minutes, I actually started to notice some smoking. And smoke is also a really good thing to look for if a component is wired incorrectly. Sometimes it might smoke. And I did notice some smoking. So I turned the amp off, and with the incorrect voltage and the smoking, I knew something had to be wrong inside my bias supply. I took a little break, went and got a drink of water, and came back with this fresh set of eyes, went through the layout again, and I discovered that there is a filter capacitor on the bias supply. And because what we're basically doing is you're taking a 50 volt AC signal, you're rectifying it so that the positive parts of the waveform are being cut off, and then the negative parts are what are being allowed to pass through. And so the filter capacitor actually needs to be wired backwards so that the positive end is to ground. And that's abnormal, and so I had done that incorrectly. I had wired that backwards. So that cap has probably been partially fried and was definitely not working correctly. So I took that guy out, replaced it with a fresh one, and that solved that problem right away. From there, my AC voltages were good. Now I install the tube rectifier, and you just kind of inch your way through the amp. So the tube rectifier goes in. You got 4 connection points on that tube rectifier. Double check the voltages that are correct, and they were, so I feel good about that. Now I go next into my B+ step-down circuit, my filter caps, and I check to see at each node that those are doing correctly, doing correct things, and in the voltages in the kind of the correct range. Now, until you install the power tubes and the preamp tubes, there's not going to be current draw through that part of the circuit. So again, the voltages also with the light bulb are not going to be exactly right, but just got to be in the general range. I was good to go there. Now I install my 2 power tubes, and I turn it on and again, check the voltages on the power tubes. Want to make sure that we're getting good, exactly where you want to see. You want a high voltage on the plate and on the screen grid. On the main grid, we want to see negative DC bias voltage that can be adjusted with the pot, and on the cathode, we want a very low voltage, and just kind of make sure we're in the ballpark there. Next, I also kind of start checking my 3.4 volt heater supply, make sure everything's good there, and we're spot on. Then turn it off, put in the preamp tubes, and run through that process yet again. Once I get to that point, and I kind of let the amp sit on for maybe a minute or 2 or 3. Again, looking for anything to start smoking or the tubes to do any weird red plating or anything like that. Just wanted to make sure that everything's good to go on that front. Everything was nice there, so was happy with that. So the next step is I actually take voltages across the entire amp. Basically, every tube connection gets measured, and also everything in the power supply gets measured, and I write it all down in a chart. I compare that chart to what you would find on the schematic and just look to see if my voltages are in line with the source. They don't necessarily need to be spot on, but we do want to be closer. And this is also the point where I take it off the light bulb current limiter and plug it straight into the wall for the first time. Once the voltages are set in place, then I move on to biasing the amp. Again, I use Rob Robernet's tube bias calculator, which is awesome. I'll leave a link in the description below. That gives me, now with this amp, I have adjustable fixed bias. So my pot can set the amount of negative DC going into the grid. I can move that up or down. But then on the cathode to ground, I have put a 1 ohm resistor in between. So with Ohm's law, because you have 1 ohm of resistance, that gives you a 1-to-1 ratio for the amount of current flowing through the tube. So when I put my negative lead on ground, my positive lead on the cathode, and I measure for resistance, when I measure for DC voltage, whatever that reading is, that is the current flow through the tube. So I just tried to set the current flow to be 60% of my value. So I got 363 volts on the plate. For a 60% bias, I was shooting for about 23 milliamps of current with 6v6s. I would say somewhere between 50% and 70% is probably where you want to be with fixed bias. 60% is a nice balance between tube longevity and also a livelier tone. And so I was really pleased with getting the bias to that point. I didn't have any problems with that. Now, with the bias set, I went on to the tremolo, because in this amp, the bias actually modulates, the tremolo actually modulates the bias. So unless the bias is set correctly, the tremolo is really not going to function right. I did discover an error. My tremolo intensity now wasn't working. It was because I had forgot to put a connection in place, which I discovered and fixed that error at that time. But once I got that in, actually, the tremolo came to life, and now I'm really hearing the amp for the first time, plugging a guitar in and actually playing it. And that's really where it's just quite a thrill to hear the amp come to life for the first time. So at this stage, let's go ahead and take a listen to the tone clips and just give you guys a feel for how this thing plays and sounds. We are taking a look at my new Princeton Reverb build. I'm really excited to test this thing out. This amp is sounding fantastic. I'm running my Part Stratocaster straight into the front of the amp. I've got an AKG C214 microphone put pretty close to the speaker, a little bit off center. I do have my foot switch hooked up for the vibrato and the reverb, and I'm just really excited to play some tones. So let's go ahead and hear it. lastly, now that you guys have heard the amp, I do want to discuss some of the modifications that I made. They're very simple, but also very powerful, and I think these are two mods that give you a ton of bang for your buck, and you could apply to any, basically, blackface Fender amp. First, you want to locate the negative feedback line. That's coming off of the speaker output, the secondary side of the output transformer, going to the speaker jack, going back into usually somewhere in the middle of the amp, near the phase inverter, perhaps. There's a resistor in there. I want to interrupt that resistor and put it on a switch. And so when you leave the path in, it's going to allow some of that signal to feed back into the amp. It's going to suppress the signal. It's going to lower the gain. It's going to make it more of a hi-fi frequency response, and definitely gives you some of that clean blackface Fender character. When you flip the switch, you interrupt that connection and just dismount it entirely. So there is no signal feeding back into itself. That's going to boost gain, boost mid-range, a little more raw feel, a little more tweed feel. Again, really good bang for your buck change, both for gain and tone and feel. Then lastly, you go to the tone stack. In the stock Princeton Reverb, it just has volume, treble, and bass. The mid-range control is actually fixed at 6.8K. You find that 6.8K resistor, and you change it out with probably a 10K or even a 25K pot. So if you've got 10K, then when you turn the mid-range control to 6, you're at about that stock or default value. But then you've got all the way up to 10 to increase that mid-range content. So with the mid-range control on 10 and the negative feedback switched out, it's a very different feeling amp compared to the default. And I just really think those two mods are awesome. Thank you very much for joining me with this long journey that we have to building an awesome guitar amplifier in this Princeton Reverb. I hope you've enjoyed it. Again, please check out the links down in the description to support the channel. Leave a comment to let me know what you think, and I'll see you again soon. Thanks, bye.